November 1884. Texas Hill Country, where the land keeps its secrets in the dark beneath your feet. A woman stands alone at the edge of an orchard in the dead of night, lamp in hand, boots in the mud. The ground beneath her just moved. Not the wind, not an animal. The earth itself, shifting, settling, breathing in a way that living ground does not breathe. She looks down. Then toward the oldest tree on the property, the one her father planted before she was born, the one that was supposed to outlast them both. Something is eating it from underneath. She doesn't run. She doesn't call for help. She walks back to the house, sits down at the writing desk, and makes a decision that will make every person in this county laugh at her by sunrise and change everything they think they know about this land before the next harvest comes. Here is her story. The notice had been nailed to the gate 3 days before the fair opened, and Rowena Voss had not touched it since. She had read it once, standing in the gray light of early morning, with dew still on her boots, and that had been enough. 14 years of her father's labor reduced to 4 lines of bank clerk's handwriting, the ink barely dry before the whole county seemed to know. Seco County in November of 1884 did not move slowly. News traveled the way drought did, invisibly at first, then everywhere at once. She arrived at the Crail Fairgrounds before most of the merchants had finished arranging their tables. The livestock pens ran along the eastern fence, and the smell of cattle and fresh hay mixed with the sharper scent of axle grease and burning mesquite from the cook fires already going near the auction barn. Wagon wheels had turned the ground into a patchwork of ruts and dry grass. Men in wide-brimmed hats stood in clusters the way they always did at the November fair, close enough to talk business, far enough apart that no one could accuse them of needing the conversation. Rowena tied her horse at the post nearest the county bank's temporary table. A plank of rough-sawn lumber balanced across 2 sawhorses beneath a canvas awning. The man sitting behind it wore a collar too tight for the weather and the expression of someone who had already delivered several pieces of unwelcome news that morning and expected to deliver several more before noon. She had rehearsed what she would say during the 18 miles of road from the Voss property into town. She had rehearsed it again while crossing the fairground. By the time she sat down across from the man in the tight collar, every careful sentence had gone out of her head, and she simply told him the truth that the orchard needed one more season, that the root damage from the dry summer had slowed the yield, that Heinrich Voss had been a careful man who had never borrowed carelessly, and that his daughter was not careless either. The man listened. He wrote something in his ledger. He told her what she already knew, that the bank's position had not changed, that the timeline was fixed, that he was sorry for her situation. She thanked him without warmth and walked away from the table with the same measured steps she had walked toward it. There was a particular kind of dignity in not letting men who held your future watch your shoulders fall. She had not planned to walk toward the grain warehouse at the far end of the fairgrounds. There was no reason to go that direction. The livestock she might have purchased, if purchasing were still a possibility, were penned at the opposite end of the grounds. But she had been walking the long way around the edge of crowds since childhood, taking the routes that kept her outside the noise rather than inside it, and her feet carried her past the auction barn, past the blacksmith's wagon, past the place where 3 men were arguing over the price of a saddle, toward the older part of the grounds where the grass had gone to seed and the fence posts leaned. The wagon was sitting behind the warehouse with no horses attached and no owner standing nearby. It was built from heavy timber with iron-banded wheels and a frame wrapped in layers of steel mesh that had been bolted, not wired. Someone had not been casual about the construction. The mesh was dark with rust along the bottom rails. The wheels had sunk slightly into the soft ground near the warehouse's foundation drain, which told her the wagon had been sitting there for at least a day, possibly longer. She heard the sound before she consciously registered it, not growling, not the sharp bark of a frightened animal. Something quieter, a slow, repetitive scrape of claws moving without urgency, without strength, the sound of something that had been trying to get comfortable inside a metal box for a very long time and had not succeeded. A deputy from the county sheriff's office was leaning against the warehouse wall, talking to an older man who sold feed down near Hondo. Rowena stopped near enough to hear without appearing to listen. 38 honey badgers, the deputy was saying. The man who had owned them ran a private hunting preserve 2 counties over, the kind of operation wealthy men from the eastern cities paid for exotic animals, guided hunts, the illusion of adventure within fenced boundaries. The owner had borrowed heavily to build it. When the money ran out, he had not closed the operation properly. He had simply stopped coming back. The county had been alerted by a neighboring property owner who noticed the wagon sitting on the road. Someone had at least moved the animals to where there was shade. No one knew who. The deputy had spent 2 days trying to find any licensed facility within 200 miles willing to take them. Every answer had been the same: no room, no staff, too much legal exposure. Honey badgers were not the kind of animal any sensible institution took on without preparation. The feed merchant made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He said something about the animals being more trouble than a drought and less useful than a broken plow, and the deputy agreed with the particular tone of a man who was not going to argue because he had already run out of better ideas. The name spread across the fairground the way anything scandalous or ridiculous spreads at a gathering of people who have been standing in a field together, long enough to be bored in fragments at first, then all at once. Honey badgers, 38 of them, starving behind the grain warehouse. Did you hear? Did you see? The laughter was immediate and widespread. Court Dellum was standing near the main livestock pen when Rowena walked back from the warehouse wall. He was a large man who had built his size into a presence, broad across the shoulders in the way of someone who had worked hard once and never entirely lost the shape of it even after he had stopped needing to. He had tried to buy the Voss land twice, once when Heinrich was alive and once the previous spring after the funeral. Both times the price he offered was the price a man offers when he believes the other party has no other options. Both times he had been wrong, or at least had been made to feel wrong, which was perhaps the same thing to a man like Dellum. He looked at Rowena across the fence rail and said it loudly enough for the people around him to hear, which was clearly the point. The Voss girl could not keep her father's trees alive, he said, and now she was going to take in wild animals that even a zoo would not touch. He said it with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for a moment like this one and found it better than expected. Several men laughed. A woman selling dried herbs near the pen entrance turned away with a smile she did not bother to hide. The deputy, who had followed Rowena without meaning to, looked at the ground. Rowena did not respond to Dellum. She had learned early from her father, who had learned it before her, that a man who speaks loudly in a crowd is speaking to the crowd, not to you. Answering him would mean accepting his terms. She looked instead at the wagon. Through the gaps in the steel mesh, at the height of her eye line, one animal had pressed its face close to the iron. The eyes were dark and direct, too alert for something so clearly depleted. It was not snarling. It was not throwing itself at the barrier. It simply watched her with the particular stillness of an animal that has calculated its situation exactly and found the calculation unfavorable but not yet final. She had seen exhaustion before in horses push past their endurance, in cattle during the worst of the dry summers, in her father in the last weeks of his illness, when the fever had taken everything unnecessary out of him and left only the essential. What looked back at her from the mesh was not the blank suffering of something that had stopped knowing where it was. It was aware. It was waiting. Her father used to say that good soil had its own smell, dark and complex, the smell of living things composting themselves into something richer. He said when that smell disappeared, you should ask what was eating it from underneath. She had thought he meant bacteria, fungal disease, the usual agricultural calamities. Standing at the mesh, she was thinking about the eastern section of the orchard and the way the ground had felt when she pressed her boot into it, near the oldest trees yielding in a way good clay-heavy soil should not yield. Loose, hollow, as if something beneath it had been systematically removed. The timing was not coincidence. She believed that in the way she believed most things she could not fully explain, not with certainty, but with the particular stubbornness of a person who had spent enough time watching the land to know that what looked like coincidence was usually just causation that had not yet been traced all the way back to its origin. She found the deputy before she could think herself out of it. She asked what the process was for emergency temporary custody of county-seized animals. The laughter, when it came again, was louder than before. The old man appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision like something that had been standing there much longer than she had noticed. He was leaning on a walking stick cut from juniper, the wood gone smooth and dark at the grip from years of handling. His face was the face of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors in a climate that did not forgive carelessness, deeply lined, the skin the color of old leather, with pale eyes that did not move the way a resting man's eyes move. They moved the way a working man's eyes move, always taking in the edges of things. He watched the wagon for a moment and then, without looking at Rowena, said that a hungry animal notices what a full animal ignores. That was all. He walked away toward the far end of the grounds with the unhurried pace of someone who has said exactly what he intended to say and does not need to wait for a response. She learned his name from the deputy while she was signing the emergency temporary care agreement, Silas Pruett. Once a land surveyor and field guide for federal geological expeditions across the southwestern territories, retired from field work after his right knee gave out on a survey party somewhere in the hill country. His permits for wildlife rehabilitation had lapsed years earlier, but his knowledge had not. He had not been at the fair to sell anything or buy anything. He came every year, the deputy said, in the way of a man who had nowhere in particular to be and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. The paperwork for temporary custody was specific: separate enclosure of reinforced timber and iron, a person with documented experience in animal handling who could verify conditions weekly, a report to the county sheriff's office within 24 hours of any incident. The terms were written by someone who understood the liability and wanted it clearly assigned. She signed her name in the space provided. The deputy looked at her signature as though he expected it to disappear. Dellum, who had drifted close enough to watch, said nothing this time. He put on his hat and walked toward the livestock pen with the deliberate unhurry of a man who has decided he does not need to comment on a situation that will resolve itself. The drive back to the property took until nearly dark. The autumn road between Crail and the Voss land ran through low scrubland before opening into the wider grassland near Perdido Creek, and the light that time of year went fast once it started going. The wagon carrying the animals rode behind her own rig on a lead rope, and the sounds from inside it settled into a complete silence she found more difficult to interpret than noise would have been. She could not see the creek from the road at night, but she knew exactly where it was. She had known the sound of it since before she could read. It ran along the northeastern edge of the property, fed by springs farther up in the limestone hills, and it had never gone dry even in the summers that dried everything else. Her father had planted the oldest section of the orchard within reach of its water table, which in those years meant planting trees that were meant to outlast the man who planted them. Property looked smaller in the dark than it did in the day. The house sat at the end of a packed earth lane, with a lamp burning in the kitchen window. She had left it lit before dawn, and she would leave it lit again tomorrow. And behind the house, the barn and equipment shed, and the long shape of the old livestock fence ran into darkness. The orchard itself was invisible, a suggestion rather than a presence. She unloaded the wagon into a temporary pen she had spent the previous 2 evenings reinforcing, using lumber from a section of old fence that had blown down the previous winter. The animals moved from the wagon into the pen without the panic she had half expected, cautiously, without aggression, with the particular economy of motion that spoke to deep fatigue. They found the corners of the enclosure first, then the water. Several drank for a long time. None fought for position at the trough. By the time she had secured the pen gate, watered her horse, and walked back to the house, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. She ate cold cornbread over the stove and looked out the kitchen window at the black shape of the enclosure. There was no sound from it. There had not been for some time. Her father's orchard record was on the shelf where it had always been, a cloth-bound ledger with his name on the front page in handwriting that was neater than his spoken speech suggested. He had recorded everything: rainfall, blossom dates, yield per tree, disease observations, soil amendments, grafting experiments going back to the first year he broke ground. The oldest entries were in German, the language he had still been thinking in when he arrived. By the middle years they shifted to English, not because he had forgotten the German, but because, he once told her, it was easier to think about land in the language of the people whose land it was going to need to become. She was looking at his entry for the spring of 1870 when she noticed something she had not paid attention to when she first read it as a girl. The eastern section shows unusual softness near root crown of mature trees, cause uncertain, no fruiting loss observed yet. Yet. He had written the word yet. She closed the ledger and set it on the table and looked at it for a long time. Silas Pruett arrived on the 4th morning, before the animals had been fed, which told her he had timed his arrival deliberately. He came through the gate carrying a canvas bag and a notebook, with a cover of dark brown leather that had cracked along the spine. He did not explain what he intended to do or ask permission to do it. He walked to the enclosure and stood at the rail and looked in for a long time. She brought him coffee from the stove in a tin cup, and he accepted it without comment, which she took as courtesy rather than rudeness, because he did not seem like a man who expressed courtesy through words. She told him about the animals she had assigned a number to, not a name, just a number, because naming them had seemed like the beginning of a different set of problems she did not need. Number 7 was the one she had been watching most. Every morning since their arrival before the feeding, it walked the entire perimeter of the pen, clockwise, always clockwise. It moved with a methodical steadiness that did not look like patrol or exercise. It looked like verification, as though the animal were confirming something, checking that what was true yesterday was still true today. It always stopped at the northeast corner. It did not stop there longer than at any other corner during the first circuit. But after completing the circuit, it would return to the northeast corner and stand there, facing through the rail toward the older section of the orchard below the small rise, the section nearest Perdido Creek. Silas drank his coffee and wrote in his notebook. On the afternoon of the 5th day, he walked the fence line between the enclosure and the orchard's lower edge. She watched him from near the shed, not following. Something about the quality of his attention made her feel that company would interrupt something she could not identify. He moved slowly, stopping every several yards. At the midpoint of the fence line, he stopped completely. He crouched down. He picked up a handful of soil from the base of the fence post and rubbed it between his thumb and fingers, and the motion was so practiced it was clear he had done it thousands of times in different places. He looked at what remained in his palm, then looked toward the oldest trees. When he spoke, the words were quiet enough that she had to take several steps toward him to hear them clearly. The ground should not be empty this way, he said. She asked what he meant by empty. He did not answer. He was looking at the trees with the expression of someone who has just heard something in a familiar melody that has never been there before, not quite alarmed, not yet confirmed in any conclusion, but no longer listening casually. He set the soil down at the base of the post with a care that struck her as almost formal, and he walked back toward the enclosure without saying anything more. The rain came the 8th night without much warning. The sky had been clear at sundown, and the temperature had dropped steadily through the evening, which in that part of Texas in November sometimes preceded a weather change and sometimes did not. She was checking the enclosure latch by lamplight when the first drops came, infrequent at first, and then suddenly not infrequent at all. She had learned to distrust heavy rain. Her father had taught her that, not in so many words, but through the habit of walking the orchard after every significant rainfall to look at what the water revealed, rather than what it obscured. Rain stripped things down. It exposed root problems, drainage failures, subterranean movement. You learned more about your land in the hours after a good rain than in weeks of dry observation. The animals changed before the rain became serious. She was still standing at the enclosure fence when it happened, and it happened too uniformly to dismiss. One moment there was the ordinary restlessness of 38 animals in an enclosed space movement, the occasional sound, the ambient energy of creatures that do not sleep heavily. Then all of it stopped, every animal. Not in sequence, not one alerting another, but simultaneously, the way a flock of birds changes direction and no individual bird appears to have initiated the turn. All of them were facing northeast, toward the creek, toward the oldest trees. Then they began to dig. Not one at a time, not several, all of them, with the coordinated urgency of animals responding to something not visible to the human being standing outside the rail. The sound of it was unusual, not frantic, not the panicked digging of something trying to escape, but purposeful and rhythmic and oriented entirely in one direction, as though each animal had independently arrived at the same understanding about where it needed to be. The lightning came in 3 flashes close together, and in the second of those flashes she looked toward the orchard, and what she saw made her stand very still for a long time after the darkness returned. The ground was wrong, not in the way it had been wrong when she pressed her boot into it and found it too yielding. Wrong in a different way, a visible way scattered across the lower orchard floor, made suddenly clear by the flat angle of the lightning, were mounds she had not seen before. Not the small work of pocket gophers, not the disruption of a single burrowing animal. These were larger, more numerous, newly thrown. She counted 17 before the third flash faded, and she lost sight of them in the rain that was now falling too heavily to see through properly. Then the ground moved. It was slight. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Beneath her boots, transmitted up through her feet and into her legs and her hands on the fence rail, a vibration that was not quite a tremor and not quite a settling, something between those things, the suggestion of a large shift occurring at a depth she could not see, below the visible soil, below the root systems, below the ordinary architecture of the earth she had been walking on her entire life. The rain erased the mounds before she could count them a second time. She stood at the fence until her coat was soaked through and the lamp in her hand had gone dim from water getting into the housing. The animals had stopped digging. All of them had stopped at almost the same moment the tremor ended, and now they were gathered against the northeast wall of the enclosure, still and quiet, facing the same direction they had been digging toward. She turned the lamp up and looked at their faces. They were not looking at her. They were not looking at the rain. They were looking through the fence, past the rise, toward the darkness where the oldest section of the orchard stood in the downpour with its roots in soil that she now understood was not the soil it appeared to be. She did not sleep well that night, and when she did sleep, she dreamed of her father walking the orchard rows the way he did every morning, running his fingers along the lower branches of each tree in turn, checking for things that someone who did not know the trees could not have identified by sight alone. In the dream, he stopped at the base of the oldest tree, the one he had called the head of the line, the one he had planted the first season he broke that ground, the one whose canopy now spread wider than any other in the orchard, and he crouched down the way Silas had crouched, and he picked up a handful of soil, and he looked at it. In the dream, the soil was not there. His palm was empty. She woke before light with her father's ledger on the table beside her, still open to the entry from 1,870, the word yet visible in the lamplight that had burned low through the night. Outside, the rain had stopped. The orchard was silent in the particular way it got after a hard rain, not peaceful, exactly, but suspended, as if everything living in it was waiting to assess the damage before deciding what to do next. She pulled on her boots and her coat and walked out before the sky had fully lightened. The ground near the house was soft but not sodden. The drainage her father had built into the property's layout was doing what it was designed to do. But near the lower fence line, where the enclosure backed up against the rise before the older orchard section, the rain had gathered and run in shallow channels between the fence posts. She followed one of those channels with the lamp, walking slowly, watching the ground. The mounds she had counted in the lightning were still there. The rain had softened their edges and worked them down, but they had not been erased the way she had first thought they had been, compacted, pressed slightly by the water into firmer shapes that were, if anything, more clearly defined in the wet earth than they had been before. She counted 22. She stopped counting at 22, not because there were only 22, but because the lamp was not reaching the outer edge of them. She knelt beside the nearest one. It was not the work of a single animal. The earth around it had been displaced upward from multiple approach angles, tunnels converging at a central point before breaking through the surface. She had seen pocket gopher work all her life. This was not that. This was the surface evidence of something larger and more organized occurring below. She pressed her hand flat against the ground between two of the mounds. Beneath her palm, very faint, like the last vibration of a bell that has been struck some time ago and is only now finishing its resonance, she felt it again. Not the tremor from last night, but its echo. The ground was still settling. She stood and held the lamp up and looked toward the head of the lime tree, its trunk barely visible from where she stood, its canopy a black shape against the lightening sky. Behind her, one of the honey badgers let out a sound that was not a growl. It was something between a breath and a bark, low and brief, the sound of an animal communicating something that required only one syllable to say. The sky was turning gray along the eastern edge. The orchard waited in the last of the darkness with its roots in earth she no longer understood. And somewhere below the surface, below the reach of the lamplight, below everything she could touch or measure with the tools she had, something was moving through the ground in the direction of the oldest trees, following a path that had been there long before she was born, following it with the particular patience of something that does not need to hurry because it knows exactly where it is going. Silas arrived the next morning carrying a steel probe rod, hand-forged, about 4 feet in length with a T-handle worn smooth at the grip. Her father had owned one and used it twice that she could remember, both times when he suspected a drainage problem he could not see from the surface. Watching Silas pull it from his canvas bag was like watching a word surface from a language she had not spoken aloud in a long time but had never fully stopped thinking in. He walked to the oldest section of the orchard without ceremony and pushed the rod into the earth at the base of a tree that had been producing consistently for 30 years. The rod went down 18 inches and stopped. Not against rock, she knew the sound of steel on limestone, had heard it many times drilling fence posts in the hill sections. This was a different resistance, softer than stone, more uniform, the kind of resistance that meant material rather than structure. He tried again, 3 feet east. The rod stopped at the same depth. Then again, moving in a slow arc around the tree's drip line. 7 attempts. The same result every time, with only minor variation in the depth at which the rod met resistance. His expression did not change during any of this. The steadiness of his face was not blankness. It was the face of a man organizing information as it arrived, fitting new observations into a framework built over many years, seeing what the new information confirmed or contradicted. When he finally straightened and looked at her, what she saw in his eyes was not surprise. Whatever was underground, he said, nature had not put it there. She took the road to Crail alone that afternoon, leaving the animals in the care of the neighbor girl, who had been helping with feeding since the second week, a practical arrangement that cost Rowena 2 jars of her preserved summer peaches per week, which was a better price than uncertainty. County Land Records office was in the same building as the courthouse, occupying 2 rooms behind the main hall, and it smelled the way all old records smelled, of paper slowly becoming something other than paper. The clerk, a thin man named Fitch who wore his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead when he was not actively using them, disappeared into the back room when she described what she needed. She heard drawers opening and closing, then a long silence, then the sound of something heavy being moved. When Fitch returned, he was carrying a rolled survey document tied with a piece of cord that had gone brittle with age. He unrolled it on the examination table with the care of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly at what speed old paper would crack. The map was from an earlier survey than the ones Rowena had seen before pre-statehood era, or close to it, with a different system of property line notation and a set of symbols she had to ask Fitch to interpret. The Voss property looked different on this map. The boundaries were the same, or close enough, but the interior was marked differently, not just topographic lines, but a secondary notation system, thinner lines drawn in a different ink, indicating infrastructure rather than terrain. Roads, water sources, constructed features. One of those lines ran northeast to southwest across the property. Thin, straight, deliberate. Not a drainage channel, the notation beside it was different and she could not read the abbreviation. Fitch leaned in when she pointed to it. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man reading something he had not encountered recently. Then he found a second document, a supplementary notation sheet from the same survey period, and read from it in a tone that suggested he was not entirely certain he was reading it correctly. A community water conveyance line, he said. Constructed approximately 1857. Connected to a communal pumping station established for the early settlement cluster that predated the current town center. 14-inch bore, timber construction with tar ceiling. The pumping station had been decommissioned in 1869 when the town's water supply was reorganized around a new well system to the west. She asked if the line had been removed when the station was decommissioned. Fitch read the notation again. Then he checked the supplementary sheet a second time, running his finger along the margin notes. There was a long pause. According to everything here, he said, no removal was recorded. She stood at the table looking at that thin, straight line crossing the northeastern corner of her father's property for a time she did not count. The line ran directly beneath the oldest orchard section. It ran parallel to Perdido Creek, close enough to share a water table but separate from it. It ran, if she traced it with her finger and translated the map scale in her head, within 20 feet of the base of the tree her father called the head of the line. An abandoned timber pipe, underground for 15 years, in soil that was well watered from the creek and warm enough for most of the year to keep its biological activity continuous. She did not need Silas's decades of fieldwork to understand what 15 years of burrowing animals and decomposing wood and consistent moisture would do to the ground around a structure like that. She understood it perfectly well from her father's ledger and her own observation. She had just never had a reason to connect the two things before. She thanked Fitch and walked out of the records office into the late afternoon light of Crayle's Main Street. The November air had turned sharp since morning. Her horse was at the post where she had left it, patient and indifferent to the county's concerns. She told Silas everything that evening at the kitchen table, the ledger open beside her to her father's 1,870 entry. He listened with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on a point somewhere between the ledger and the window. When she finished, he did not speak immediately. He opened his own notebook to a page she had not seen before, older entries. The ink faded to a brown that was barely legible in the kitchen lamplight. He turned the notebook toward her and pointed to a line of his own writing. She had to lean close to read it. It was from 1,871. A note about an orchard south of a settlement she did not recognize, an orchard of peach trees rather than pecans, owned by a family he identified only by a surname she did not know. The note read, "Pocket gophers following abandoned water channel, lateral root systems suspended above, collapsed tunnels, total loss of eastern planting within 31 months of first visible symptoms." He had been here before. Not on this property, not in this county, but at this problem, this exact configuration of abandoned infrastructure and burrowing animals and failing root systems, and a landowner who had not yet understood what they were standing on. She looked up from the notebook. He was watching her. She asked if he had been able to save the orchard in 9,871. Took the notebook back slowly, closed it with one hand. He had arrived, he said, after the second season of visible damage. By then, the tunnel network beneath the eastern section had collapsed in enough places to sever the primary lateral roots. The trees looked sick from above. Underneath, they had nothing left to stand on. The silence that followed was the kind that does not require filling. She sat with it. Outside, the wind had picked up along the creek bottom, and she could hear it moving through the upper branches of the orchard in the darkness, a sound she had known so long it had become something close to the sound of her own thinking. 3 days after her visit to the records office, the honey badgers stopped digging entirely, not gradually, completely, as though a signal had been given that she had not heard. She discovered it on the morning of the fourth day when she went to the enclosure before feeding and found the interior undisturbed, the earthen floor showing only the marks of the previous night's work along the northeast wall, none of it fresh. But the animals had moved. All 38 had shifted their position overnight and now occupied the eastern fence line, pressed against the rails, facing outward toward the drainage ditch that ran along the property's edge below the lower orchard. She observed them through 3 evenings. The behavior did not vary. Each evening at roughly the same hour they gathered at the eastern fence, not restless, not vocalizing still, watching something she could not see from where she stood. On the 4th evening she walked toward the ditch herself, carrying the lamp and moving through the dry grass at the lower edge of the orchard. She was perhaps halfway to the ditch when she noticed the marks in the mud at the bank's edge. Not the large prints of honey badgers, smaller, more numerous, the delicate track pattern of pocket gophers, dozens of individual marks overlapping in a way that suggested not a single animal coming and going, but many animals passing through at intervals. She followed the marks along the bank until she found an opening in the soil, beneath the grass a tunnel entrance, smooth-walled and wide, much wider than a standard pocket gopher burrow. She crouched beside it and moved the lamp close. From inside the opening, moving upward in a slow and steady current, came a draft of cool air, underground air. The temperature of it was several degrees below the ambient night temperature, which meant the space it was coming from was substantial, not a simple burrow but a cavity, or a series of connected cavities, large enough to maintain its own atmosphere. She stood and looked back toward the enclosure. The lamp's light did not reach that far, but she could hear the animals not sound exactly. More the sense of weight and presence along the fence line, the way you can feel a crowd before you can distinguish individual people in it. None of them had moved. None of them had looked away. She was still standing at the ditch when the ground spoke for the second time. It was not the same as the first tremor. That had been a shift, a single movement, deep and brief. This was a sound rather than a vibration, a low resonance that she felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears, the way thunder from a distant storm announces itself in the body before the sound wave fully arrives. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It came from beneath her feet and moved outward in all directions, and then it was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt thinner than the silence before it. She stood very still. From the direction of the oldest trees, something fell. Not a large branch, the sound was lighter than that. The sound of bark or a small dead limb dislodged from height. Then nothing. She walked back to the house without running, which was a choice she had to make consciously several times during that walk. Fletcher Odom's inspection came on a morning when the light was bad, low clouds pressing down from the north, the temperature barely above freezing, the ground still damp from a light frost that had not fully melted by mid-morning. He arrived in a wagon with the county seal painted on the side panel and a clipboard that he held against his chest like a man who has learned not to set things down at farms because farm dogs have opinions about clipboards. He was thorough in the way of a man who has been given a task and intends to execute it without enjoying or regretting it. He checked the enclosure fencing with his hands, not just his eyes, pushing against posts to test their setting, checking the bottom rails for evidence of undermining. He reviewed the feeding records she had kept in a separate notebook since the second day. He checked the water quality by filling a small glass jar and holding it up to the flat sky. He found 3 problems. She knew he had found them before he said anything, from the way he paused at each discovery and wrote something down rather than moving on. The bent rail on the southeast corner, a section of fencing that a large animal had pushed against repeatedly, not enough to breach but enough to compromise. The 2-day gap in the feeding record. She had been repairing the drainage channel near the shed during a period of rain, and had failed to enter the daily totals until the 3rd day, recording them accurately but not contemporaneously. The animal with the injured foot number 14, who had been limping since the 1st week, an old injury she had been monitoring but had not yet had examined by anyone with a formal certification. Fletcher wrote his assessment in the careful block letters of a man who knows his notes may be read by someone else at some point. His recommendation: conditional notice, 10 days to demonstrate corrective action, or the temporary custody arrangement would be reviewed for termination. He handed her the copy of the assessment with the expression of a man who is doing his job correctly and is not comfortable with the fact that doing his job correctly is going to cause a problem for someone who has not done anything wrong in any meaningful sense. Court Dellum was standing outside the gate when Fletcher came through it. She had not seen him arrive, which meant he had come quietly, possibly on foot from the road. He said nothing while Fletcher climbed into the county wagon and started the horses moving. He watched Rowena instead, and the quality of his attention was different from the contemptuous amusement she was accustomed to from him. He was calculating something, the expression of a man revising an estimate. He did not stay long. He put his hat back on and walked toward the road without speaking, and the sound of his boots on the frozen ground was deliberate in a way she did not like. She spent the remainder of that day repairing the southeast rail with iron bar stock she had been saving from a broken cultivator frame, wiring it through the existing post brackets at 3-point intervals. She annotated the feeding records with an explanation that made the gap legible, not altered. She would not alter them, but clarified. She wrote a request to the county veterinary officer asking for a formal examination of number 14 within the week. 6 days remained in the 10-day period. On the night of the 6th day, the orchard gave way. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, with both notebooks open in front of her, her father's ledger, and her own, not reading so much as tracing backward through the record, looking for the earliest signs she could find of the ground beginning to change beneath the oldest trees. She had been at it for 2 hours when she heard the sound. It did not come from the enclosure. It came from the orchard itself, a low, sustained groan that was not wind and not animal, the sound of something structural releasing a pressure it had been holding for a very long time. She was out of the house with the lamp before she had consciously decided to move. The night was cold and clear, the stars visible, no wind. She crossed the yard at a walk that became something faster without becoming a run, passing the enclosure where the animals had pressed against the northeast rail in a silent mass, every face turned toward the orchard. She went through the gate at the lower fence line and up the small rise and stopped. The ground beneath the head of the lime tree had collapsed. Not a small settling, not a crack at the surface, a depression 4 feet across and nearly 2 feet deep, the earth fallen cleanly into the space below it the way flour falls through a sieve. The exposed edges of the hole were straight-sided, not crumbled, which meant the void below had been large enough and established enough that the surface layer had held until it could not. The roots of the oldest tree ran to the edge of the hole on 3 sides, some of them now hanging free in the open air, white in the lamplight against the dark earth. She crouched at the edge and held the lamp down into the space. The hole did not bottom out where she could see. Below the fallen surface, below the tangle of exposed root, there was open ground extending northeast, not a simple burrow, but a passage, wide enough to put your arm into at a measured reach. Running along what she now understood was the corridor of the old conveyance pipe. Pipe itself was not visible, or what remained of it was not distinguishable in the dark from the surrounding earth. What was visible was the absence it had created, a tunnel system so extensive that when one part finally gave way, the surface above it had simply stopped being surface. She sat at the edge of the hole until the lamp burned low. The temperature dropped. She did not go back to the house. Silas arrived at first light and found her still there, sitting on a piece of root at the edge of the depression with her coat pulled tight and the extinguished lamp beside her. He did not make any sound of alarm when he saw the hole. He walked to the edge and looked in with the expression of a man whose worst reasonable estimate has been confirmed at the lower end. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the ground a foot from the edge. He held it there for several seconds. Not speaking, then he stood. She asked how many more trees might be sitting above ground like this above nothing. His answer did not come quickly. He looked along the row of oldest trees stretching northeast toward Perdido Creek. each one standing in the early light with the ordinary solidity of things that have not yet revealed what they are standing on. All of them, he said, if the tunnel network connects the way I believe it does. Every tree along that corridor. She looked at the head of the lime tree, its canopy spread 20 feet across. Her father had stood beside it the year before he got sick and put his hand on the bark and said something she had not heard clearly and had not asked him to repeat. She asked Silas whether the trees could be saved if the tunnels were addressed now. He was quiet for long enough that she stopped expecting an answer. Then he said he did not know, and it was the first time she had ever heard him say those words in that order. She went back to the house before the neighbor girl arrived to feed the animals. She sat at the writing desk in the corner of the main room where she kept the household correspondence paper and the ink bottle and the pen her father had bought in San Antonio the summer she turned 12. She uncapped the ink and held the pen over the paper for a moment before she began to write. She addressed the letter to the Division of Geological and Natural Surveys of the state of Texas, care of the Capitol offices in Austin. She had found the address on a pamphlet that had come with a soil analysis guide sent to her father several years earlier by a university extension program he had written to asking about root disease in mature pecan trees. She had kept the pamphlet because her father had kept it, and she had kept most of what her father had kept because it was easier than deciding what to throw away, while she was also deciding everything else. She wrote carefully and in sequence, the way her father had taught her to write anything intended to be read by a stranger, not with emotion, not with appeal, but with fact and order, and enough specific detail that the reader could verify the account without taking anything on trust. She described the property and its location, and the age of the orchard, and the date of the tremors, and the depth at which Silas's probe rod met resistance. She described the county survey map she had examined at the records office, and the notation about the 1,857 water conveyance line and the 1,869 decommissioning record that contained no documentation of removal. She described the behavior of the animals in her temporary care, the directional digging, the clockwise patrol, the gathering at the eastern fence, the clear air current rising from the drainage ditch tunnel. She described what she had found in the orchard 2 hours earlier, the collapsed surface above the head of the lime tree, the exposed passage running northeast, the roots hanging in open air. She proposed a supervised ecological trial. She asked for a survey of the underground conditions using whatever instruments the division possessed for such assessments, and she asked for authorization to proceed with a controlled, monitored trial if the survey confirmed what she believed the survey would confirm. She did not ask for their opinion of her theory. She asked for their tools and their oversight. She sealed the letter and set it on the corner of the writing desk and went to do the morning work that still needed doing, regardless of what was collapsing underground. 4 days remained in Fletcher Odom's 10-day window. She sent the letter the following morning by the mail rider, who came through the Crail Road on Tuesdays. She had spent the remaining hours of the previous night finishing the enclosure documentation Fletcher had flagged, writing the annotation for the feeding records in her clearest hand, and preparing a second written request for the county veterinary officer regarding number 14. By the time the sky lightened, she had been awake long enough that her hands felt separate from her, a familiar sensation from the worst weeks after her father died. She filled the hole near the head of the lime tree with packed clay and river gravel from the creek bank, knowing it would not solve anything but understanding that an open void at the base of the oldest tree was an invitation to further collapse. She worked alone. The neighbor girl watched from the fence line without asking questions, which Rowena appreciated more than she would have been able to articulate. Number 14's foot examination happened on the 8th day. The veterinary officer who came was a young man who had been practicing in the county for only 2 years and who stood outside the enclosure for a full 3 minutes before he was willing to enter it. He was thorough once he committed. He assessed the injury, a deep bruise with no fracture, applied a poultice, and recorded everything in the county log with the meticulous handwriting of someone who had recently completed formal training and had not yet begun to abbreviate. He signed Rowena's corrective documentation and left without making any editorial comments about the nature of the animals or the wisdom of keeping them. On the morning of the 10th day, Fletcher Odom did not appear. He appeared on the 11th day instead, arriving in the county wagon an hour after sunrise. He reviewed her corrected documentation without sitting down, standing at the kitchen table with his coat still on, reading with the focused attention of a man who does not want to miss something he will later wish he had caught. The rail repair. He checked himself, returning to the enclosure and pushing against the southeast corner with both hands. The feeding record annotation he read twice. He wrote something in the county log. He signed the temporary extension 7 additional days, conditional on no further incidents. He handed her the copy with the expression of a man who has made a correct bureaucratic decision and is aware that correct bureaucratic decisions are not always the same as good ones. She thanked him. He was walking to his wagon when he paused and looked back over his shoulder, not quite turning around, his eyes on the enclosure rather than on her. Whatever those animals are doing over there at the fence line, he said, it is not normal animal behavior. She agreed with him. He seemed to want to say something more. He did not. He climbed into the wagon and turned the horses back toward the Crail Road. On the sixth night of the animals' changed behavior, the nights of standing at the eastern fence, watching the drainage ditch without moving or vocalizing, Rowena heard the sound she had not been expecting, not from underground, from the surface of the lower field beyond the fence line. She went to the kitchen door and held the lamp out into the cold night air. The ground beyond the lower fence line was moving, not the earth itself, the surface of it, the short dry grass and the winter bare soil between the grass clumps, moving with a dark, continuous, flowing motion that she recognized after a moment as animals. Many animals. Moving together from the direction of the drainage ditch toward the orchard perimeter, crossing the open ground with the directional coherence of water finding its level. Pocket gophers did not cross open ground at night. They did not leave their tunnel systems voluntarily, did not expose themselves to predation, did not aggregate in the open in any number she had ever heard described. She had read everything her father's modest collection of agricultural texts had to say about the species, and she had spoken to enough neighboring farmers over the years to understand the animal's behavior well. What was happening in front of her was not that behavior. Something had changed below the surface. Something had changed so fundamentally that staying underground had become less safe than leaving it, and the animals were leaving it in the way animals leave a structure when the structure itself is failing. The collapse at the head of the lime tree had not been an isolated event. It had been the beginning of a cascade that the animals underground could sense long before any human standing on the surface would be able to measure it. From the enclosure, a single sharp sound from one animal, brief, decisive, then the sound of the entire enclosure shifting to the eastern fence in a body. She watched the ground for a long time. The flow of animals across the lower field did not slow. More tunnel entrances opened. More animals emerged, the grass rippling in the lamplight as something that had been contained below the surface pushed upward and outward with the patience of something that had simply run out of reasons to stay. She went back inside. She added a postscript to the letter she had already sent, written on a separate page and sent the following morning with the same mail writer since the date of my initial correspondence. A surface collapse has occurred at the base of the oldest tree in the affected section, and I have observed mass above-ground migration of pocket gopher populations from the drainage corridor. The situation is accelerating. The letter from Austin arrived on the 14th day after she had sent the first one. It was written on division stationery with a printed letterhead and signed by a man named Theodore Bain, who identified himself as a civil engineer attached to the division's field survey branch. His letter was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged receipt of her communication. The second described his initial assessment of the situation as warranting further investigation on the grounds that the behavioral indicators she had described, combined with the documented history of the water conveyance infrastructure, represented a geologically significant risk to the land in question. The third paragraph stated that he intended to travel to Seco County within the week to conduct a preliminary surface assessment. He arrived on a Thursday in early January of 1885, 10 weeks after the honey badgers had come home with her from the Crail Fairground. He came on horseback from the direction of San Antonio, arriving at the gate in the mid-afternoon with a box of instruments tied to the back of his saddle and dust from 2 days of road on his coat. He was 44 years old. She estimated perhaps a year or two older. His face had the particular kind of calm that belongs to people who work outdoors in complicated terrain and have learned that agitation does not improve survey conditions. He reviewed her written documentation at the kitchen table while she made coffee, asking 2 precise questions during his reading, one about the depth of the probe rod resistance and one about the direction of the air current from the drainage ditch tunnel, and accepting her answers with the same economy of response with which he had asked them. She showed him the filled collapse site at the base of the head of the lime tree before the light failed that afternoon. He crouched beside it with his own rod, testing the packed clay she had put in, then testing the ground several feet in each direction. He moved around the base of the tree in a slow circle, not hurrying. When he stood, he looked at the canopy above them bare in January, every branch distinct against the cold sky with the expression of someone performing a calculation that is going to produce a number he does not want. He said he would need a full day with his instruments before he could say anything definitive. He said it the way a man says something when the definitive thing he will eventually say is already taking shape in his mind and he is simply not ready to say it yet. He worked the following day from first light until the sun was fully behind the hills to the west. His method was different from Silas's probe rod. He used a longer steel rod in combination with a brass-fitted listening instrument, a device that amplified the acoustic properties of the subsurface in a way she found difficult to understand fully from his brief explanation, but which appeared, from watching him work, to allow him to differentiate between solid soil, compacted material, and open space by the sound the rod made when tapped. He moved through the eastern orchard section in a systematic grid, pausing at each test point to listen for several seconds before moving on. Silas, who had arrived before Bain that morning, without being told the engineer was coming, watched from near the equipment shed with his notebook open on his knee. At mid-afternoon, Bain drove his rod into a point 20 feet from the filled collapse site, listened, moved 2 feet, and tried again. Each time he listened longer than at the previous point. He drove the rod into 5 more positions in a slowly widening circle before he stopped working and stood in the middle of the eastern orchard for a long time without writing anything down. She walked to him. His face, when he turned toward her, had lost the particular calm she had observed during his reading of her documentation. Not alarmed, something more specific than alarmed. The look of a man who has asked a question he expected to confirm a modest problem and has received instead an answer that significantly revises the scale of what he is dealing with. He told her what he had found in the careful language of someone translating a technical assessment into terms that require accuracy without technical fluency in the listener. The entire northeastern section of her orchard, everything within approximately 80 yards of the old water conveyance line, was underlaid by a connected system of open chambers. Not a tunnel here and a tunnel there. Not isolated pocket gopher burrows. A network. Chambers communicating with one another through lateral passages following the line of the abandoned pipe and extending outward from it in both directions, reaching in some places depths of 3 feet and in others nearly 5. The weight of 60 mature pecan trees, he said, was currently distributed across a lattice of empty space. She looked at the trees around her, their ordinary winter shapes, bark the color of iron, branches bare against the pale sky, roots invisible beneath the surface. They looked exactly as they had always looked. They looked like trees that would be there in another 60 years. He used a phrase she did not immediately understand. He repeated it when she asked more slowly. The question, he said, was not whether further collapse would occur. The question was when and how much of it at once. That evening he wrote his preliminary assessment by her kitchen lamp and sealed it for courier to Austin the following morning. When she asked what he intended to recommend, he looked at his sealed envelope for a moment before answering. He intended to recommend a formal subsurface survey with the division's more precise instruments, he said, combined with a supervised ecological trial contingent on that survey's findings. She asked if he thought Austin would approve it. He did not answer that question directly. What he said instead was that he had never in 15 years of fieldwork seen a property owner correctly identify a subsurface structural failure of this scale from surface behavioral observation alone. She understood that as a kind of answer. She was not certain it was the kind she needed. Outside, the eastern orchard stood in the dark above its failing foundations, holding everything her father had planted and everything he had intended, suspended above hollow ground. Waiting with the particular patience of something that does not know. It is waiting because the land does not know. It simply continues, right up until the moment it cannot. Austin's reply came 3 weeks after Bain's sealed report had left on the courier wagon. Rowena was repairing a section of the lower irrigation channel when the mail rider stopped at the gate, and she read the letter standing in the field with mud on her boots and the January wind pushing at the paper in her hands. The division authorized a full subsurface survey. More significantly, it authorized a supervised ecological trial contingent on that survey's findings, subject to oversight by a designated field officer and the cooperation of the relevant county authorities. Bain was named as the supervising engineer. The letter was formal and brief in the manner of official correspondence that has been reviewed by more than one person before being sent, each reviewer having removed anything that could be interpreted as enthusiasm. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and went back to the irrigation channel. She told Silas that evening. He was sitting on the chopping block near the equipment shed, which had become his preferred position when he was thinking, rather than working close enough to the animals to hear them, far enough from the house to have an unobstructed view of the eastern orchard's silhouette. He read the letter once, folded it along its original creases, returned it. The county, he said, would not be easy. She knew that. The county was Crail, and Crail was the men at the livestock pen at the November fair, and Crail was Fletcher Odom's careful neutrality, and Crail was Court Dellum watching from outside the gate with the patient expression of someone who understands that time moves in his favor if he simply does not interfere. She sent a formal request to Fletcher Odom the following morning, asking him to arrange a meeting between the division's field representative and the relevant county authorities. She wrote it in the same careful register she had used with Austin, factual, sequential, no appeal to sympathy. She described the survey authorization and the ecological trial proposal and the engineering assessment Bain had already conducted. She included a copy of the division's letter. Fletcher's response took 4 days. He would arrange a meeting at the Crail courthouse. He would notify the relevant parties. He made no editorial comment on the proposal itself, which she read as neither opposition nor endorsement, but as the behavior of a man positioning himself to be on whichever side the meeting decided was correct. Bain arrived 2 days before the meeting with his full survey equipment, a heavier set of instruments than he had brought the first time, transported in a wooden case that required 2 men to carry from the wagon. He brought a young assistant from Austin, whose job appeared to be carrying things and writing down numbers while Bain dictated them. They worked for 2 full days in the eastern orchard, moving through the grid Bain had established during his preliminary visit, but now with finer intervals, the assistant driving the measuring stakes while Bain worked the instruments. Silas watched from his position at the equipment shed and did not offer opinions. The young assistant asked him once, on the afternoon of the second day, how long the old man had been observing the property. Silas told him 30 years of similar properties, which was technically accurate and entirely uninformative, and the assistant wrote it in his notebook anyway. By the end of the second day, Bain had completed his survey and spent 2 hours at the kitchen table reducing his field notes to a single diagram. The diagram showed the northeastern section of the Voss property in plan view, with the tunnel network rendered in gray hatching over the property boundary lines. Looking at it, Rowena understood for the first time the full extent of what she was standing on. The gray hatching covered more than 2/3 of the area she thought of as the old orchard. In several locations, near the base of the largest trees, the hatching darkened to indicate chambers of significant size, not passages but rooms. Essentially, where the tunnel network had widened around old pipe decay points and the collapse of lateral root systems that had nothing left to anchor them. The head of the line tree stood at the center of the darkest concentration of hatching on the entire diagram. The site of the November collapse was marked with a small notation in Bain's precise hand: confirmed surface failure, filled, ongoing subsurface risk. Bain set his pen down and looked at the drawing with her for a moment. What he said next was something she turned over in her mind many times afterward, that the ground beneath a living thing often tells the truth about that thing's future long before the surface does. The courthouse meeting was held on a Thursday morning in the second week of January. The room used for such gatherings was a square space off the main hall, with a long table of raw-cut lumber and chairs that did not match, occupied by the county judge, an elderly man named Hargrove, who had held the position for 19 years, and who listened to everything with the expression of someone translating between languages in his head. The county sheriff's deputy, Fletcher Odom, 3 of the larger landholders in the county, and Court Dellum, who had no official standing in the meeting and who had come anyway. Bain presented his survey findings with the economy of a man accustomed to making technical cases to non-technical audiences. He used the diagram. He described the method. He explained in plain terms what a connected subsurface cavity system of this scale meant for the long-term structural stability of the orchard above it. He did not dramatize. The numbers in the diagram did not require dramatization. Dellum spoke before Judge Hargrove had the opportunity to respond. He was talking about liability and about the precedent of releasing dangerous animals into agricultural land, and about the fact that no one in the room had any evidence that the animals would do what the theory suggested they would do. He said it without heat. Dellum operated without heat, which made him more effective in rooms than men who raised their voices. Bain did not argue. He acknowledged that the trial was a proposal, not a certainty. He acknowledged the liability considerations and described the oversight protocol he intended to implement. He said that the alternative, doing nothing, was not neutral. Doing nothing was a choice with a predictable outcome, and he had documented that outcome in the survey diagram currently on the table. He pointed to the marked notation above the head of the line tree. One surface failure had already occurred, he said. It would not be the last. Fletcher looked at the diagram for a long time. Then he looked at Rowena, who was sitting beside Bain and who had not spoken yet. His expression was asking a question he had not formed into words. She told the room what she had told the county records clerk 6 weeks earlier, but this time she told it differently, not as a sequence of discoveries, but as a single continuous observation that had begun before the animals arrived, had continued through their arrival, and had been confirmed by the survey diagram now on the table, and by the collapse she had found in the dark with a lamp and no one else present. She had noticed the silence first, she said, the absence of owls, the absence of coyote tracks along the creek, the absence of the hawks that had hunted the lower orchard every autumn of her life until 2 years before. She had noticed that the predators had withdrawn before she understood why. The honey badgers had not created the situation. They had identified it. She did not look at Dellum while she spoke. She looked at Judge Hargrove. The judge had been sitting with his hands folded on the table since the meeting began. He unfolded them now and placed them flat on the diagram. He looked at Bain. He asked one question: if the trial proceeded and produced no meaningful result within a defined period, what was the county's exposure? Bain described the indemnification structure in the division's authorization letter. The state carried the primary liability for the trial itself. The county's exposure was limited to the standard oversight responsibilities Fletcher's office already held. Hargrove looked at Fletcher. Fletcher gave the smallest possible nod, the nod of a man who has decided something but does not want to be the one who decided it. The judge approved the trial, conditional on a defined observational period, continuous supervision, immediate termination authority vested in Bain and Fletcher jointly, and weekly written reporting to his office. Dellum was already standing when Hargrove finished speaking. He put on his hat with a deliberateness that communicated everything he did not say. He walked out of the courthouse without looking at Rowena, which she found more unsettling than if he had looked directly at her. A man who has made a decision looks at the thing his decision concerns. A man who has not yet made a decision does not. The morning they opened the enclosure gate was the coldest morning of that January. Fog had come in from the creek bottom before dawn and not lifted, and the eastern orchard was barely visible at the distance of 30 yards. Bain's assistant had arrived before sunrise to finish stringing the temporary perimeter fence that would contain the trial to the eastern section, a low barrier, not intended to stop a determined animal but to define the boundary clearly so that observers could see what remained inside it. The observers were standing outside the temporary perimeter when Rowena walked to the enclosure. Fletcher Odom with his clipboard, Bain with his field notebook, the young assistant, two of the landholders from the courthouse meeting, a man from the San Antonio Daily Express who had arrived the previous afternoon, sent by his editor on the basis of a brief report from the county correspondent about a geological survey of an unusual nature. He was young, the reporter younger than Rowena, and he had the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who had traveled a long distance for a story and was not yet certain he understood what the story was. Dellum was there. He was standing 20 yards farther back than the other observers, apart from them, which was either a statement of his position or simply the behavior of a man who does not stand with groups. She had stopped being able to interpret Dellum's choices as simple things. Silas was beside her at the enclosure gate. He did not hold the gate or touch the latch. He stood near enough that she could have reached out and put her hand on his arm, which she did not do, but the possibility of it was something she found steadying. She lifted the latch. The first four animals came through the gate with the unhurried directness of something that has understood its situation and decided to act on that understanding. They did not scatter. They did not investigate the perimeter or the gathered observers. They moved in a single direction northeast, toward the older trees, nose down, their movement through the frost-stiff grass making less sound than she expected. At the third tree from the fence line, the lead animal slowed. It moved around the base of the tree once, then stopped at a point on the eastern side and began to work the soil there with its 4 feet. Not aggressive work, not the urgent digging she had seen in the enclosure during the rains. Systematic, measured, as though it were doing something it had planned. The second animal found a different position 6 feet from the first. The third moved further east. The fourth disappeared into a depression between two roots. Then the ground opened. Not catastrophically, not with the drama of a full collapse. A section of soil between two of the oldest trees sank 12 inches in the space of a breath. A controlled subsidence along what was clearly a tunnel line that had been undermined to the point of structural failure. Loose earth filled the depression. From the open edge of the subsidence, still moving, the second animal emerged, pulling the largest pocket gopher Rowena had ever seen, dragged backward out of what must have been a burrow running along the tunnel system's main axis. The reporter stopped writing. He simply stood with his pencil above his notebook and watched. Over the following 4 hours, the eastern section of the Voss orchard changed in ways that Rowena found difficult to describe when she was later asked about them, because change of that kind, not dramatic, not violent, but relentless and cumulative, does not translate well into the language of events. What happened was that the ground began to resolve itself. Tunnel systems that had been maintained under pressure were breached from inside by animals that understood the layout better than any survey instrument could map it, because the instruments had to infer from surface signals what the animals knew from direct passage. Each breach reduced the pressure on adjacent tunnels. Each collapsed chamber released the tension in the root zone above it. By midday, the count of significant subsurface collapses had reached 23. Bain's assistant was recording their locations on a copy of the survey diagram with a marking pencil, and the marks were clustering along exactly the corridor the diagram had indicated, the line of the old conveyance pipe, extending northeast toward Perdido Creek. Dellum had moved closer to the perimeter fence than he had been in the morning. He was watching the orchard floor with an attention he had not brought to the courthouse meeting. Fletcher had stopped taking notes. He was simply watching. Silas had not moved from the position he had taken at the start of the morning, standing at the corner of the temporary perimeter with his arms folded and his notebook unopened in his left hand. When Rowena came to stand beside him, he did not turn his head. "The orchard," he said quietly, "is learning to breathe again." She did not answer. She was watching number 7, which had been released with the second group of animals, and which had, within minutes of entering the trial area, gone directly to the northeast corner of the orchard, stopped at the place she recognized from weeks of observation as the spot it had always faced from inside the enclosure, and begun to work. It was still working when the afternoon light began to fail. The weeks that followed were the strangest she had known on that property, stranger, in their way, than the weeks of tremors and night migrations and sealed letters, because those weeks had the strangeness of crisis, which has a recognizable shape, while these weeks had the strangeness of something mending. Mending does not have a shape. It proceeds unevenly, in ways that confuse the eye, because you are looking for evidence of health in a context where you have grown accustomed to looking for evidence of failure. The owls came back first. A single great horned owl appeared in the tall cedar at the property's eastern boundary on the 9th night after the trial began, and she heard it from the house, that unmistakable low call, moving through the cold dark, before she saw its silhouette against the stars when she went to the door. She stood in the doorway for a long time after it stopped calling. A coyote crossed Perdido Creek 11 days into the trial, leaving tracks in the creek mud that she found the following morning. Not a hunting track, the stride was relaxed, the path not purposeful, an animal moving through familiar territory it had avoided for some time and was now returning to for reasons it had not communicated to anyone. Bain documented everything. He was meticulous in the way of someone who understands that the credibility of what he is watching depends entirely on the quality of his record, and that the record will outlast the watching. He was at the property 4 days out of 7 during those first weeks, and on the other 3 days his assistant was there instead. Silas was there every day. She did not always speak to him when she walked the property in the morning. Some mornings he was already at the eastern fence when she arrived, having come through the gate while it was still dark, and she would find him standing, watching, the notebook sometimes open on his knee. She brought him coffee, and they would stand together looking at the orchard until one of them had something worth saying, which was not every morning. He told her one morning in late January, when the weather had turned briefly mild and the light on the eastern grove had the flat, clear quality it only had in winter, making every branch visible in its particularity, that people think an ecosystem is a collection of parts. He paused long enough that she thought he had finished. Then he said, "It is more like a conversation, and when one voice goes silent, all the others shift to fill the space, but they fill it wrong, because the conversation was not meant to work that way." She thought about that for a long time. The predators had not disappeared from the Voss property because the land had failed. They had disappeared because something below the surface had altered the balance in a way that moved the prey. Population moved it in numbers, moved it in behavior, and the predators had followed the prey's signal, not the land's. The land had kept speaking. Nobody had been listening to it. Bain returned in early March with his revised field measurements. He sat at the kitchen table with the updated diagram, the original survey hatching, now marked with a second color showing the collapsed and resolved tunnel systems, and talked through the numbers in the careful sequential way she had come to expect from him. Pocket gopher activity within the managed trial area had decreased by more than 70% relative to his baseline estimates. Root zone compression, measured by the resistance of the same probe rod Silas had used in November, had normalized across the majority of the eastern section. 4 of the largest trees in the oldest section showed new bud development ahead of the usual schedule, which Bain said he could not directly attribute to the trial, but which was consistent with a root system under reduced competitive pressure. She asked him what the report to Austin would say. The report, he told her, would say what the data showed. He would not characterize what it meant for the property's future, because characterization was not his field. What he could say, as the man who had done the survey, was that the eastern section of the Voss orchard was no longer in acute structural danger. What happened next depended on whether the ecological balance held. She walked him to his horse afterward, and at the gate he stopped and looked back at the orchard, with an expression she recognized as the expression of a man filing something away, not the technical facts, which he had in his notebook, but the particular experience of watching something work in a way he had not expected it to work. He had been doing this work for 15 years, he said. He had never seen a landowner correctly identify a subsurface structural emergency from the behavioral signals of animals in temporary custody. He said it the way a man says a true thing he has been deciding whether to say. She told him she had not identified anything. She had only stopped long enough to pay attention. April arrived with warmer air and the soft mud smell of the creek banks thawing, and with it came Court Dellum. He came alone, without the deliberate timing he usually employed, arriving at mid-morning on a weekday when she was working on the irrigation valve near the south field. She saw him from a distance, his horse, his particular way of sitting in the saddle, the width of his shoulders against the spring sky. She kept working until he reached her. He dismounted without ceremony. He did not open with the kind of talk that men like Dellum usually opened with: the weather, the cattle market, the deferential approach to a request. He took a folded document from his coat and held it toward her, and the directness of the gesture was itself a change. The document was an engineering drawing, hand-drafted, detailed, the work of someone who knew what they were doing. It showed a drainage system layout for a property she did not immediately recognize, though the topography was familiar. Low hill to the north, creek line to the east, flat agricultural land running south. His property. The eastern section, the orchard he had planted 8 years ago on land that had previously been cattle range. He had seen the signs, he said, starting 3 weeks after the courthouse meeting. The ground softening near the oldest trees. The drainage behaving differently after rain. He had brought in a man from San Antonio to look at it. The man had probed the soil and come back in 2 days with a look she now recognized from her own experience. He did not say he had been wrong at the courthouse meeting. He did not say he had been wrong at the November fair. He looked at the irrigation valve she was repairing, and then at the eastern orchard behind her, where the newest growth was visible, even from this distance, a color slightly more vivid than the surrounding brush, the particular green of trees that have been relieved of a slow pressure. He asked if she would look at his drawings. She took the document from him and unfolded it against her knee. The drainage design was better than competent, more sophisticated than she would have expected him to produce, which told her he had spent serious time on it, rather than having someone else produce it to his vague specifications. He had been thinking about the problem. He had been thinking about it since the courthouse meeting, perhaps before. Looking at a man's drawings tells you something about him that looking at the man himself does not. The decisions in these drawings were the decisions of someone who had stopped thinking about the land as an asset to be managed and started thinking about it as a system to be understood. That was not a small change. She knew how much it cost because she had made it herself. She told him the eastern retention channel was too shallow for the soil type, that in a wet year it would back up and create exactly the kind of subsurface moisture that encouraged the burrowing patterns he was trying to prevent. She told him the spacing of the outlet culverts needed to account for the clay lens that appeared in that part of the county at about 4 feet of depth. He listened with the attention of a man who has, at some expense to himself, decided to listen. She handed the drawings back. She told him she was not an engineer. She told him he should take them to Bain. He accepted the drawings and refolded them. He put them back in his coat. He looked at the orchard again for a moment, then back at her, and what he said next came out of him with the particular difficulty of words that have been waiting in a man's throat for some time before they were allowed out. He had spent 30 years, he said, believing that every problem on a piece of land was a problem you solved with force or money or both. He had believed it because it had been true often enough to become the only principle he used. He looked at the eastern orchard. He said she had reminded him that some things answered to neither. She did not tell him he was forgiven, because forgiveness was not the right frame for what he was describing. He was not confessing to a sin. He was reporting a revision. She respected revisions more than apologies, because revisions had consequences where apologies did not. She told him to come back in a week. She would introduce him to Bain. Silas's health began failing in November of 1885. Not dramatically, it was not the kind of failing that announces itself. It was the kind that you first notice as a change in pace, then as a change in duration, then as a change in what a person can do on a given day. He still came to the property. He came less frequently. When he came, he stayed for shorter periods. She watched the change without commenting on it, because she understood that commenting would change what he told her, and she wanted him to tell her things rather than to reassure her. He told her one morning in December, sitting on the chopping block with his coat buttoned to the throat against a cold that was sharper than it had been in previous years, that the notebook was nearly full. He had been keeping that notebook for 29 years. He said it the way a man says a practical fact without ceremony, without the weight that she could feel the fact deserved. She asked if he had another one. He thought about it. He said he had the same amount left to write as the notebook had pages to write it in, which was how he usually knew it was time to stop. She did not know, standing beside him on that December morning with the cold coming off the creek and the eastern orchard showing its winter shape against the pale sky, that this was one of the last mornings she would spend with him at the property. She learned later that he had known and that he had said nothing about it, for the same reason she had learned not to say certain things, because saying them changes the quality of the time remaining, and the time remaining was worth more undisturbed. He died in January of 1886, in the first week of the new year, in his sleep, at the age of 79. His niece, who had been staying at his house since October, sent word to Rowena the morning after. She went to his house, a small frame building at the edge of Crail that she had never visited before. His niece, a composed woman in her 40s named Adelaide, who had her uncle's pale eyes but not his particular kind of stillness, met her at the door. She led her through to a back room that smelled of tobacco and old paper. His few belongings were already arranged, because Adelaide was a practical woman. On the writing table, set apart from the other items with a deliberateness that told Rowena it had been placed there intentionally, was the notebook. Adelaide told her that Silas had not left written instructions about much. He had left a written instruction about this. Rowena took the notebook with both hands. She opened it on the road home, sitting in the wagon with the reins loose over her knee, and the horses finding their own way along a road they had traveled enough times to know. The entries ran to within 4 pages of the back cover, the last ones dated from November and early December of the previous year. The observations were what they had always been: soil conditions, animal behavior, rainfall, ground temperature, the small precise measurements of a man who had spent his life paying attention to things that do not communicate in language. The last entry was dated the 14th of December, 2 lines. An observation about the recovery rate of the root zone compression measurements in the Voss eastern section, and a note that the great horned owl he had first logged in September had now been sighted on 11 separate occasions and appeared to have established a territory along the creek. She turned the page. On the inside of the back cover, written in the careful hand he used for his longer notes, not the compressed fieldwork shorthand of the entries, but the deliberate cursive of a man who wants to be read clearly, was a single sentence. Watch the quiet things first, nothing before it, nothing after it. No salutation, no signature, no date. Only the sentence, written in the center of the page with the ink slightly darker than the entries, as though he had written it separately from everything else, as though he had always known it would be the last thing in the book. She sat with the notebook open in her lap for a long time, while the horses moved at their own pace through the winter landscape toward the property that had grown from an inheritance into something she understood she would spend the rest of her life being responsible for. The creek came into sight along the eastern boundary, and then the orchard, the whole of it, the younger sections and the middle sections in the eastern grove, which stood in the January light, with a density she had not seen in several years, its branches carrying the particular weight of trees that have enough in their roots to make it to another season. She closed the notebook. She placed it on the wagon seat beside her father's ledger, which she had brought with her without thinking about why, only understanding afterward that it was what she always brought when she needed to think about something she could not think about in the house. The two notebooks sat beside each other on the worn wood of the wagon seat, her father's, thick and much repaired, and Silas's, slim and almost full. Two men who had spent their lives watching the same kind of ground and writing down what it told them. She had inherited one set of notes and been given the other, and the fact of having both felt less like luck than like a responsibility she had not asked for and was not going to put down. She did not frame the sentence immediately. She carried the notebook home and set it on the kitchen shelf and lived with it there for some weeks before she understood that putting it somewhere safe was not the same as honoring what it contained. She framed it in early spring, using a piece of cedar board her father had cut and smoothed for a different purpose and never gotten around to using. She hung it on the wall of the equipment shed, above the level of the doorway, where anyone who came to work would see it before they saw anything else. The first person to read it there, other than herself, was a young woman from a farm near Catula, who had come to ask about the drainage problems in her father's pecan grove. She was 17, earnest, wearing good boots for working in. She read the sentence in the doorway of the shed and then looked at Rowena with the expression of someone encountering an idea at exactly the right moment in their life. Rowena handed her a shovel and told her the best way to understand a drainage problem was to trace it backward from where the water came out to where it went in. They walked the property together for 2 hours, and by the end of it, the young woman had identified 3 separate drainage failures she had been looking directly at without seeing. She went home with a list of things to check and a copy of Bain's published report, which Rowena kept a small stack of on the shelf beside the framed sentence. Bain's formal report had been published in the spring of 1887 in the Texas Agricultural and Geological Review, a journal with a modest readership that consisted primarily of working professionals in both fields and a small number of progressive landowners who paid attention to such publications. The report was technical and careful and presented no conclusions that were not directly supported by the documented data. Rowena's name appeared in the acknowledgments as the owner of the subject property who had initiated the survey request, which was accurate and understated in equal measure. She read the published report once. She found one factual error in her own recollection, a date she had remembered slightly wrong, and one place where Bain had characterized her role more modestly than she thought was quite accurate. She wrote him a short letter noting the date discrepancy. She did not write about the other thing, because it was not the kind of error that affected the science, and the science was what mattered. Word of the report moved through the agricultural community in the way practical information moves slowly at first, through professional networks and county extension meetings, then faster as the practical implications became clear to people working land with similar characteristics. She received her first inquiry letter from outside Seco County in the summer of 1887. By autumn, she had received 11 more. By the following spring, she had lost count. She did not write long replies. She wrote the same essential information in different words each time, pointing to Bain's report for the technical content and describing the practical sequence of her own experience for the human content. She recommended that anyone facing similar conditions contact the division directly and request a survey. She did not describe herself as a person who had solved anything, because she had not solved anything. She had noticed something, and she'd been stubborn enough to follow the notice to its conclusion. Dellum's orchard in the eastern part of Seco County was surveyed by Bain in the autumn of 1885 and found to have an early-stage version of the same problem, a smaller network, less developed, caught before any surface failure had occurred. The intervention there was less dramatic than at the Voss property and proportionally more successful. The tunnel system was addressed before it became a crisis, and the trees Dellum had been worried about were still standing and producing when Rowena last heard news of them. He had taken what she showed him and used it without ceremony, which was the most useful thing he could have done with it. She never asked him to acknowledge what had happened at the November fair. He never did. That seemed, eventually, like the right arrangement. The midsummer of 1888 brought a dry spell that reminded the older residents of Seco County of the bad summers of the previous decade, not quite as severe, but carrying the same quality of suspended threat, the grassland going brown in July, the creek dropping to its lowest summer level in several years. Rowena walked the eastern orchard in the worst heat of it, in the early morning before the sun had fully cleared the hills, looking at the trees she had spent 4 years alternately fearing for and nursing. They looked different. Not dramatic in their difference, she had learned by now not to expect drama from recovering land, but different in the particular density of their canopy, the color of the leaves, the way the light came through the upper branches with more interruption than she remembered from the years of slow decline. The drought was working on them the way drought always works on pecan trees in that part of Texas. It was stress, but it was manageable stress, the kind that a tree with intact root systems and stable soil takes in the natural cycle of dry years and wet years and dry years again. She came to the head of the line tree, the oldest one, the first her father had planted, the one whose root zone had been the center of the worst of the tunnel network, the one beneath which the ground had opened on a cold night in November of 1884, while she sat at her kitchen table, reading her father's words about the year 1870. The filled collapse site was indistinguishable now from the surrounding ground. Grass had come in over it. She had to think carefully about where it had been before she could locate the slight variation in the soil color that marked it. She pressed her boot into the ground near the base of the tree. It held. She crouched and picked up a handful of soil from between two surface roots. It had weight to it, the right weight, the weight of soil that is occupied by living things rather than hollowed out by them. Her father had told her good soil had a smell. She pressed it between her palms and raised her hands toward her face. It was there, dark, complex, the smell of something composting itself into something richer. The smell that had been absent for years from this part of the orchard, so absent that she had stopped noticing its absence. Which is how you know something has been wrong for a long time. When you stop expecting it, you stop missing it. She heard a movement in the upper canopy. A red-tailed hawk settled onto a high branch near the center of the tree, adjusted its grip, looked at her for a moment with the frank assessment of a raptor, then turned its attention to the orchard floor below. She stood. She opened her hand and let the soil fall back where it had come from. She brushed her palms on her skirt, picked up her harvest basket from where she had set it at the base of the tree, and moved to the next tree in the row. The morning was already warming. Down the creek, where the grass had come back thick along the water margin, since the previous autumn, something moved through the brush with the particular unhurry of an animal that knows it belongs there. The hawk above her shifted on its branch. From somewhere in the middle orchard, one of the honey badgers, 4 of them remaining on the property, the rest transferred to a preserve in the hill country. The previous spring made the low sound it made in the morning, the sound that was less a communication than a confirmation. Still here, still working, still attending to the ground below. She walked the row. The basket grew heavier as the morning advanced, and the light moved through the orchard the way it moves when the canopy is full enough to matter, patching the ground with shapes that shifted when the breeze came through. The oldest trees stood at the end of the row, with their roots in soil that knew what it was supposed to hold, and the ground beneath her feet was steady, and the season was turning the way seasons turn when the land has been given back its own way of proceeding. She did not stop to mark the morning as significant. Significant mornings have a way of announcing themselves only in retrospect, and she had learned from the men whose notebooks sat on her kitchen shelf that the work of attention does not pause for its own recognition. You watch, you record, you return the next morning and watch again. The hawk took off from the canopy without warning, a sudden weight and rush of displaced air, and climbed in a wide spiral over the eastern grove before leveling out toward the creek. She watched it until it was too small to follow. Then she lowered her eyes to the basket, assessed what remained to be done, and continued down the row.